In 1598, a Dutch fleet dropped anchor off the eastern coast of a volcanic island in the Indian Ocean that no human civilization had ever called home. The sailors waded ashore through warm shallows and walked into dense forest, where they encountered a bird unlike anything in their experience. It stood about a meter tall, roughly the height of a 3-year-old child, with stubby, useless wings, thick yellow legs, and a massive hooked beak that curved downward like a blunt sickle. The bird walked directly up to them. No fear. No hesitation. No attempt to flee. They grabbed it with their bare hands, killed it, roasted it over a fire on the beach, and wrote in the ship's journal that the meat was tough, greasy, and so unpleasant that several of the men refused to eat more than a few bites. They gave the bird a name, Walgvogel. In Dutch, that translates roughly to disgusting bird. That was 1598. By 1681, just 83 years later, a span shorter than a single human lifetime, every dodo on the planet was dead. Not reduced, not endangered, not clinging on in some remote valley, erased completely. The entire species gone in the time it takes one person to grow old. The question sounds almost too simple. If the bird tasted so terrible that sailors who had been surviving on hardtack and salt beef for months at sea still winced at the flavor, why on earth did we eat it into extinction? The answer is far more unsettling than the question suggests, because the truth is, we did not really eat the dodo into extinction at all. What humans did to that island was considerably worse than hunting a bad-tasting bird. And what the dodo's disappearance reveals about how species actually go extinct is something the modern world has still not fully absorbed. Mauritius, roughly 8 to 10 million years ago. The island did not exist yet. Deep beneath the Indian Ocean, a volcanic hotspot was forcing molten basalt upward through the oceanic crust, building a landmass the way a welder builds a bead of metal, layer by slow layer. When the volcanic activity eventually subsided and the basalt cooled, what remained was an island of approximately 2040 square kilometers, about the size of Greater London or roughly half the size of Long Island, sitting alone in the Indian Ocean roughly 100 kilometers east of Madagascar, a distance comparable to the drive from New York City to Miami. Over the next several million years, life found its way to Mauritius, but only certain kinds of life. Only the kinds that could cross more than 1,000 kilometers of open water. Seeds drifted in on ocean currents and lodged in the volcanic soil. Insects were swept across the channel by cyclone winds. Bats, the only mammals capable of sustained flight over open ocean, arrived under their own power and colonized the forests. And birds came on the wing. What did not arrive was everything else. No rodents, no cats, no dogs, no pigs, no primates, no snakes large enough to threaten a bird. No ground-dwelling predators of any kind. Mauritius was a world without mammalian hunters. For millions of years, the only threats a ground-dwelling animal faced on this island were disease, storms, and old age. The forests that grew on the volcanic soil were extraordinary. Enormous ebony trees formed a dense canopy that filtered the tropical sunlight into a green twilight on the forest floor. Tambalacoke trees, with their thick-shelled fruit the size of a small fist, grew alongside palms and pandanus. The understory was dense, with ferns, mosses, and ground cover plants that formed a thick carpet across the forest floor. Giant Mauritian tortoises, animals weighing over 100 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large adult man, moved slowly through the undergrowth, feeding on fallen fruit and leaves. Mauritius giant skinks basked on warm rocks at the forest edge. Rodriguez, flying foxes, fruit bats with wingspans approaching half a meter, roughly the length of a baseball bat, hung from branches and massive roosts. And among all of this, walking freely across the forest floor without concern, were the descendants of that original pigeon. By the way, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand the full system behind how these deep dives get researched and structured from the ground up, the complete framework is available as an ebook. Check the link in the description below. It walks through everything from how we source the original studies to how the narrative gets built. Now back to the pigeon that became a dodo. Because what happened to that pigeon over the next several million years is one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary transformation in the entire bird family tree. When the ancestral pigeon first arrived on Mauritius, it was a capable flyer. It had strong pectoral muscles, a deep-keeled breastbone for anchoring flight muscles, hollow bones to reduce weight, and properly shaped flight feathers. It looked, in all probability, something like the modern Nicobar pigeon, a striking bird with iridescent green and copper plumage that still lives on small islands across the eastern Indian and Pacific Oceans. In 2002, molecular biologist Beth Shapiro, then working at the University of Oxford, published a phylogenetic analysis that confirmed the dodo's closest relative was the Rodriguez solitaire, another giant flightless bird that had lived on the nearby island of Rodriguez and gone extinct around 1778. Both species descended from that shared flying pigeon ancestor, and both had independently evolved flightlessness, giant size, and ground-dwelling lifestyles in response to the same environmental pressure. No predators. Evolution does not maintain expensive traits that provide no survival benefit. Flight is among the most calorically demanding abilities in the animal kingdom. A bird in active flight burns energy at a rate roughly 10 to 15 times its resting metabolic rate. Maintaining the massive pectoral muscles, the hollow lightweight skeleton, the specialized feather structure, and the cardiovascular capacity required for flight is a biological investment that only pays off if flying keeps you alive. On Mauritius, that investment returned nothing. There was nothing to fly away from. The pigeon could walk to its food, which was scattered abundantly across the forest floor. It could nest on the ground without risk. It could raise its chicks in the open without a single predator threatening the nest. Every calorie spent maintaining flight capability was a calorie wasted. So over thousands of generations, the birds that invested less in flight and more in body size, foraging efficiency, and reproduction had a slight advantage. Wings shrank centimeter by centimeter across geological time. Bodies grew heavier. Leg bones thickened to support the increasing mass. The keel of the breastbone, that deep ridge where flight muscles anchor, flattened and diminished until it could no longer support muscles capable of generating lift. Flight feathers degraded into soft, fluffy plumage that served for insulation and display but could not move air. What emerged after millions of years of this optimization was Raphis cucullatus, the dodo. A bird weighing between 10 and 17 kilograms, roughly the weight of a medium-sized dog, depending on the time of year and which study you consult. It had a huge, powerful beak that could crack the toughest nuts and seeds on the island. Its legs were stocky and muscular, built for walking long distances across uneven forest terrain. Its tiny wings were purely decorative, vestigial reminders of an ancestor that once crossed 1,000 kilometers of ocean. For a very long time, the image most people carried of the dodo was a fat, stupid, waddling bird, barely competent enough to survive its own existence. That image came almost entirely from 17th-century European paintings and descriptions of captive dodos that had been shipped to Europe and overfed in royal menageries. The dodo in those paintings is bloated, round, almost comically ungainly. It looks like a creature designed by someone who had never seen a functional animal. In 2011, paleontologist Julian Hume at the Natural History Museum in London published detailed anatomical research based on the actual skeletal remains of wild dodos recovered from excavation sites on Mauritius. The picture that emerged was dramatically different. The wild dodo was leaner, more upright, and considerably more athletic than any European painting had ever depicted. Hume described a muscular, well-proportioned bird with powerful legs and a body structure clearly adapted for active foraging across the forest floor. Subsequent studies using 3D digital modeling by researchers including Leon Claessens confirmed Hume's assessment. The dodo was not a biological failure. It was a precisely engineered organism, perfectly calibrated for a very specific environment. This decision to build a body for a predator-free island seemed small at the time. It was not, because the same adaptations that made the dodo perfectly suited to Mauritius, its flightlessness, its ground nesting, its lack of fear, its slow reproductive rate, would become the exact vulnerabilities that destroyed it the moment its environment changed. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Mauritius sat undisturbed in the Indian Ocean for millions of years after the dodo evolved. No human beings set foot on the island. Arab and Austronesian traders may have known of its existence. Medieval maps from the 12th and 13th centuries reference island chains in the general vicinity that could be the Mascarenes. But none of them settled. None of them stayed. Portuguese navigators were likely the first Europeans to sight the island. Some historians attribute the discovery to Domingo Fernandes Pereira around 1507 during a voyage through the Indian Ocean. Others point to Pedro Mascarenhas around 1512, who gave his name to the entire island group, the Mascarene Islands. But the Portuguese were focused on establishing trade routes to India and the Spice Islands. A remote volcanic island with no obvious spices, no gold, and no existing trade infrastructure held no interest. Ships may have anchored briefly for water, but they moved on. For nearly another century, the dodo continued its existence undisturbed, walking the forest floor, cracking nuts, nesting in the leaf litter, raising a single chick each breeding season in perfect safety. Then, on a September morning in 1598, the sails of Vice Admiral Wybrand van Warwick's Dutch fleet appeared on the horizon. The Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde de Oostindische Compagnie, was the largest and most profitable trading corporation on Earth at the time, a commercial operation with revenues that, adjusted for inflation, would dwarf any modern multinational. Van Warwick's fleet was heading to the East Indies to trade for spices, and Mauritius was a convenient place to stop, take on fresh water, and let crews suffering from scurvy eat fresh food. What the Dutch found when they went ashore was a world that had never experienced large, ground-dwelling mammals. The giant tortoises did not flee, the fruit bats did not flee, and the dodos, those large, flightless birds that had been walking the island's forests for millions of years, without encountering a single serious threat, walked directly toward the sailors. Biologists call this phenomenon ecological naivety, sometimes also called island tameness. When a species evolves for thousands of generations without predators, it never develops the instinctive flight response that mainland species carry. The dodo had no framework for understanding danger from a large, ground-dwelling animal. Humans were just another creature in the forest. Interesting, maybe. Threatening? Absolutely not. The sailors did not have to hunt. They walked up to the birds, grabbed them, and clubbed them to death. Some accounts describe sailors killing dodos by the dozen with nothing more than sticks. The birds barely reacted, even as others were being killed around them. The concept of predation was simply absent from their evolutionary vocabulary. And then the Dutch roasted them, and the reviews were, to put it mildly, unfavorable. The ship's journal from the vessel Gelderland, which visited Mauritius in 1601, describes the birds as walgvogels. Other accounts from the early 1600s describe the flesh as tough and requiring prolonged cooking to become even marginally edible. The meat was oily, with a strong flavor that Dutch palates found thoroughly unappealing. The birds were large enough to provide a significant amount of meat per kill, but the quality of that meat was a genuine problem. Some sailors preferred to eat the island's parrots or pigeons, which were smaller but far more palatable. There is also the matter of the name itself. The word dodo has uncertain origins. Some linguists trace it to the Portuguese word dudo, meaning fool or simpleton, which would date the name to the earlier Portuguese encounters with the island. Others connect it to the Dutch dodor, meaning sluggard. Still others have suggested it might be an onomatopoeia, an approximation of the bird's own call. The bird accumulated a small collection of unflattering names from every culture that encountered it, none of them suggesting that anyone was particularly impressed. Now here is the question that cuts to the center of the story. If the dodo tasted genuinely terrible, and better food was readily available on the same island, why did the Dutch keep killing them? Part of the answer is straightforward. Sailors coming off months at sea were desperate for any fresh meat. Salt pork and hardtack were the staples of long ocean voyages, and by the time a ship reached Mauritius, crews were suffering from scurvy, malnutrition, and profound boredom with their diet. A bird that tasted bad was still fresh protein. The standards of a man who has been eating salt-crusted dried beef for 3 months are not the standards of a man choosing a restaurant on a Friday night. But the deeper answer, the one that actually matters, is that hunting was never the primary cause of the dodo's extinction. The math simply does not support it. Mauritius was not a permanent Dutch settlement until 1638, a full 40 years after Van Warwick's first arrival. Before that, the island was an occasional stopover. Ships would anchor for days, sometimes weeks, and crews would forage before departing. The number of dodos killed during these visits was real but limited. A crew might kill a few dozen during a stop. Some accounts mention salted dodo meat being loaded into barrels, but these references are rare and always secondary to descriptions of tortoise provisions. Even after permanent settlement in 1638, the Dutch colonial population on Mauritius was tiny. At its peak, the settlement probably never exceeded a few hundred people. Genetic analysis of dodo remains recovered from the Marais-aux-Songes fossil site suggests the pre-human dodo population numbered in the tens of thousands, potentially higher. A few hundred settlers eating the occasional bad-tasting bird cannot account for the extermination of tens of thousands of animals across an island of 2,040 square kilometers. The hunting was real. The revulsion at the taste was also real. But neither of those facts, separately or together, explains why the dodo disappeared from the earth in less than 83 years. The creatures that actually killed the dodo never appeared in any ship's journal. They were never named in any sailor's account. And most of them arrived on the island, without any human being deliberately bringing them. When Dutch ships anchored off Mauritius and sent boats ashore, the boats were not the only things that made the crossing. Below deck, in the holds and storage compartments of every European vessel of that era, were rats. The black rat, Rattus rattus, had been a stowaway on human ships for centuries. These animals were prolific, adaptable, and capable of surviving almost anywhere that provided food and shelter. Every time a Dutch vessel lowered its boats, rats scrambled down mooring ropes and dropped onto an island that had never known a single rodent in its entire geological history. The rats found the dodo's eggs almost immediately. Consider what this meant in practical terms. The dodo nested on the ground. It had evolved for millions of years in a world with no ground-dwelling egg predators. Its nest was not hidden in a tree cavity. It was not suspended from a branch. It was not wedged into a cliff face. It was a shallow depression on the forest floor, sometimes lined with leaves, containing a single large egg. That egg was nutritionally dense, completely exposed, and defended only by a parent bird that had no concept of what a rat was or why it should be afraid of one. The rats ate the eggs. They ate newly hatched chicks. They did this at night, moving through the forest floor in the darkness while adult dodos roosted. They did it during the day while adults foraged away from the nest. And because the dodo laid only one egg per clutch, a single clutch per breeding season, every egg destroyed by a rat represented a complete reproductive failure for that pair for the entire year. And if that were the only problem, the dodo might have survived it. Populations under pressure from a single introduced predator can sometimes stabilize at lower numbers and persist. But the rats were only the first wave. The Dutch brought pigs. Domestic pigs were standard provisions on oceanic voyages, and sailors routinely released breeding pairs on islands they planned to revisit, creating a self-replenishing food supply for future stops. Feral pigs are among the most destructive invasive species on Earth. They are omnivorous, intelligent, physically strong, and relentless foragers. On Mauritius, released pigs went feral within a generation and began rooting through the forest floor with their powerful snouts, destroying ground nests, consuming eggs and chicks, churning up the soil that ground-dwelling invertebrates depended on, and competing with the dodo for the fallen fruit and seeds that formed its primary diet. Then came the crab-eating macaques. These small primates, native to Southeast Asia, were transported to Mauritius, either as exotic pets or as incidental cargo on trading vessels. On the island, they thrived. Macaques are agile, curious, group-living animals with excellent manual dexterity and a broad omnivorous diet. They raided bird nests, ate eggs, ate chicks, competed for fruit, and colonized the forest canopy and floor simultaneously. For a ground-nesting bird like the dodo, macaques represented yet another novel predator that could find and destroy nests in locations and at times of day that rats and pigs might miss. Goats were released to graze freely, providing milk and meat for the settlers. Goats are notorious for their ability to strip vegetation down to bare soil. On an island where the understory had been stable for millions of years, goats consumed seedlings, low-growing plants, and ground cover that provided the dodo with both food and nesting concealment. Dogs accompanied the Dutch settlers. Cats were brought to control the rats, which had by now become a nuisance in the settlement itself, though the cats proved far more interested in hunting the island's native wildlife than in controlling the rodent population they had been imported to manage. Which, looking back, was either incredibly predictable or incredibly poorly thought through. The dodo was now facing an invasion on a scale that no island species had ever been designed to survive. Not one predator, not two. An entire ecosystem of mammalian predators, competitors, and habitat destroyers, arriving simultaneously on wooden ships from the other side of the planet. If this kind of deep dive into extinction science is what brings you to this channel, hit subscribe now. We release these regularly, and the algorithm stops recommending this content to you if you are not subscribed. The next one goes into something from the deep geological record that makes this story look gentle by comparison. While the dodo was being squeezed by introduced mammals on the forest floor, a separate force was dismantling its world from above. And the two pressures together created a feedback loop from which no recovery was possible. The Dutch East India Company did not colonize Mauritius for its wildlife, it colonized Mauritius for its trees. Ebony, specifically. Mauritian ebony was dense, dark, beautifully grained, and enormously valuable on European markets. The company authorized systematic logging operations that began shortly after permanent settlement and continued for decades. The ebony forests that had defined Mauritius for millions of years were cut down methodically. Trees that had taken centuries to grow were felled with axes, stripped of their branches, and hauled to the coast for loading onto ships. The canopy that had sheltered the entire island ecosystem, regulating temperature, humidity, and light levels on the forest floor, was opened up section by section. For the dodo, deforestation was not merely the loss of shade, it was the collapse of its food supply. The fruits and seeds that the dodo depended on came from specific tree species. When those trees were removed, the seasonal supply of food that had sustained dodo populations for millions of years shrank. The understory plants that provided nesting material and concealment were trampled by cattle and consumed by goats. The invertebrates that lived in the leaf litter, a secondary food source for the dodo, declined as the forest floor ecology unraveled. Deforestation also expanded the zone where introduced species could thrive. Rats and pigs do better in disturbed, open environments than in dense primary forest. As the Dutch logging crews opened up the canopy, they were inadvertently creating ideal habitat for the very animals that were destroying the dodo's nests. The same trees that had sheltered the dodo for millennia were now being converted into the currency that funded the operation destroying them. The company harvested the forest. The harvest paid for the colony. The colony maintained the livestock. The livestock destroyed the habitat. The cycle was self-reinforcing, and nobody involved in it had any idea that a species was disappearing as a result. This is the detail that changes the entire equation. The dodo's extinction was not a story of gluttony. It was not a tale of sailors eating a bird because they were too lazy to find better food. It was a full-spectrum ecological collapse caused by the simultaneous introduction of multiple invasive species combined with large-scale habitat destruction, all operating on an island ecosystem that had evolved in total isolation from every single one of those pressures. And the biology of the dodo itself made recovery impossible. 1 egg per clutch, 1 clutch per breeding season, on the ground. No defensive behavior against mammalian nest predators. No instinct to flee from approaching animals. No ability to produce a replacement clutch quickly enough to compensate for the rate of nest predation. No capacity to relocate to safer nesting sites because there were no safer nesting sites. The rats were everywhere. The pigs were everywhere. The macaques were everywhere. And the forest was shrinking. Paleontologist Julian Hume and biologist Anthony Chek, who co-authored extensive research on Mauritian extinction ecology, estimated that the combination of invasive species predation and habitat loss would have reduced dodo reproductive success to near zero within just a few decades of the introduction of mammals. That does not mean the species vanished instantly. Adult dodos may have continued walking the forests of Mauritius for years, even decades, after the last successful breeding season. But the population was aging out. Every adult that died of natural causes was not being replaced by a younger bird. The species was functionally extinct, a population of aging adults with no next generation, long before the last individual actually died. If the dodo had been able to lay 6 eggs per clutch instead of 1, or nest in trees instead of on the ground, or produce 2 breeding cycles per year instead of 1, the story might have been different. Even a modest increase in reproductive output could have buffered against the losses from predation and allowed a reduced population to stabilize. But the dodo's reproductive strategy had been calibrated over millions of years for an environment where egg and chick survival was nearly guaranteed. In a predator-free world, laying 1 egg at a time and investing heavily in each offspring is an efficient strategy. You lose almost nothing and gain a healthy, well-developed chick each season. In a world suddenly overrun with rats, pigs, and macaques, that same strategy became a death sentence, delivered 1 empty nest at a time. Tracking the last living dodos is an exercise in reading fragmentary colonial records that were never designed to document wildlife populations. The Dutch administration on Mauritius kept records of their commercial and military activities, but the dodo was not a priority. It appeared in journals sporadically, usually mentioned in passing in the context of food provisioning or as a natural curiosity described for audiences back in Europe. Nobody was counting them. Nobody was conducting surveys. The bird was simply part of the island's background, noticed when convenient and ignored otherwise. The last widely cited first-hand account of a living dodo comes from Volkert Everts, a Dutch sailor who was shipwrecked on a small islet off the southeastern coast of Mauritius in 1662. Everts and his companions survived on the islet for several days and described encountering dodos there. The detail that biologists find significant is the location. If dodos were surviving on small offshore islets by 1662, it may indicate that the birds had already been pushed off the main island by the pressure of invasive species and habitat loss. The small islets, too rocky or remote for feral pigs and macaques to easily colonize, may have served as temporary refuges, temporary being the operative word. Some historians extend the extinction date to 1681, based on a report attributed to Isaac Johannes Lemosius, who served as the Dutch commander of Mauritius, and mentioned the bird in a description of a hunting expedition. But the reliability of that account has been debated for over a century. Whether the last living dodo drew its final breath in 1662 or 1681, the window of coexistence between Homo sapiens and Raphis cucullatus on Mauritius was staggeringly brief. Less than 83 years, a geological eye blink, a period shorter than the life expectancy in most developed countries today. And then something happened that is, in its own way, almost as remarkable as the extinction itself. The dodo was forgotten. By the early 1700s, the bird had faded from European awareness so thoroughly that naturalists began questioning whether it had ever been real. The handful of preserved specimens, a few dried heads, scattered foot bones, and partial skeletons distributed across museum collections in Oxford, Copenhagen, and Prague, were treated as curiosities of doubtful origin. Some 18th-century scientists openly speculated that the dodo was a myth, an exaggeration cooked up by sailors prone to embellishment. The idea that an entire species of large, conspicuous bird could have existed and then simply vanished from the world was, to many Enlightenment thinkers, implausible. The concept of extinction itself was not widely accepted in European science until the early 19th century. It took the work of 19th-century naturalists to resurrect the dodo from obscurity. The publication of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, which featured a dodo as a character, brought the bird back into popular culture. And in that same year, George Clark, a schoolteacher living on Mauritius, discovered a massive deposit of subfossil bones in the Mare Songe, a marshy depression in the southeastern part of the island. Clark's excavation recovered hundreds of dodo bones from the waterlogged sediment and confirmed beyond any remaining doubt that the bird had been real, had been widespread on the island, and had been completely annihilated. The Mare Songe would become one of the most important paleontological sites in the world for understanding island extinction. Major re-excavation campaigns in 2005 and 2006, led by an international team that included paleontologist Julian Hume, recovered thousands of additional dodo bones, along with remains of giant tortoises, endemic reptiles, and other species that had vanished from Mauritius after human arrival. The sediment layers preserved a chronological record of the island's ecology, showing a rich, stable fauna that persisted for thousands of years, then abruptly collapsed within a century of first human contact. The sheer volume of bones told its own story. The dodo had not been rare before humans arrived. It had been abundant. The fossil record showed a healthy, stable population that experienced no significant decline until the moment the Dutch set foot on the island. The extinction was not the culmination of a long decline. It was a sudden catastrophe, inflicted on a thriving species by forces it had never encountered and could not have adapted to in time. In the 21st century, the dodo became more than a symbol painted on museum walls. It became a subject of molecular biology at the highest level. Beth Shapiro, who had moved from Oxford to the University of California, Santa Cruz, continued pushing the boundaries of ancient DNA analysis. Her lab extracted DNA from preserved dodo specimens in museum collections across Europe, and in 2022, completed the full genome sequencing of the dodo. The genome confirmed the phylogenetic relationships her earlier work had established, showing the dodo and the Rodrigue solitaire as sister species descended from a common pigeon ancestor, with the Nicobar pigeon as the closest living relative. But the genome also revealed something that bones and historical accounts never could: the dodo's population genetic history. The data showed relatively low genetic diversity, consistent with a species confined to a small island for a very long period. But critically, it showed no evidence of a pre-human decline. The genetic signatures of population stability were clear. Before 1598, the dodo population was not shrinking. It was not struggling. It was not circling a drain that humans merely pushed it over. It was stable, healthy, and reproductively functional. The extinction was entirely a product of human contact and its cascading consequences. Every time you see a Nicobar pigeon, with its iridescent green and bronze plumage shimmering in the light of a tropical island, you are looking at the closest living echo of a lineage that once produced the most famous extinct animal on the planet. The genetic distance between them is vast, representing tens of millions of years of independent evolution. But the connection is real. The same ancestral pigeon family that eventually produced the Nicobar pigeon also produced, on a volcanic island in the Indian Ocean, a flightless giant that walked confidently into the arms of its killers because it had never had a reason to walk away from anything. In 2023, Colossal Biosciences, a de-extinction biotechnology company co-founded by geneticist George Church of Harvard University and entrepreneur Ben Lamb, announced a partnership with Beth Shapiro to attempt something that previous generations of scientists would have considered impossible. They plan to use the complete dodo genome to guide the editing of Nicobar pigeon DNA, progressively introducing dodo-specific genetic traits into viable embryos. The goal, stated plainly, was to bring the dodo back. Whether this will succeed remains genuinely uncertain. De-extinction is a field with enormous technical hurdles that no team has yet overcome for any species. Editing a genome is not the same as reconstructing an organism. The dodo was shaped by millions of years of interaction with a specific island environment that no longer exists in its original form. The forests have been altered. The introduced species are still there. A genetically engineered approximation of a dodo raised in a laboratory and released onto modern Mauritius would not be the same animal that cracked Tambala cocknuts on the forest floor 4 centuries ago. But the ambition itself reveals how deeply the dodo's extinction has embedded itself in human consciousness. This is not just an extinct bird, it is the extinct bird. The one whose name became shorthand for irrecoverable loss in the English language. The phrase "dead as a dodo" entered common speech precisely because the disappearance was so complete, so rapid, and so seemingly absurd that it became a cultural reference point for the idea that things can vanish permanently. And this is where the story of one bird on one island stops being a historical curiosity and becomes a warning about a pattern that is still operating across the planet today. Mauritius was not an anomaly, it was a template. Everywhere humans have arrived on previously isolated islands, the result has followed the same devastating script. The moa of New Zealand, 9 species of giant flightless birds, the tallest standing over 3.6 meters, roughly twice the height of an average adult man, were exterminated within approximately 200 years of Polynesian settlement. The elephant birds of Madagascar, the heaviest birds that ever lived, with some species weighing close to 500 kilograms, roughly the mass of a grand piano, disappeared within centuries of human colonization. The Hawaiian honeycreepers, once one of the most spectacular adaptive radiations in the bird world, with over 50 species descended from a single finch ancestor, have been reduced to fewer than 17 surviving species, with several balanced on the edge of extinction right now. In every case, the mechanism is the same. Humans arrive. They bring rats, pigs, cats, dogs, goats, and diseases. They clear forests for agriculture, timber, and settlement. The native species, which evolved in isolation without exposure to any of these pressures, collapse. Direct hunting plays a role, sometimes a significant one, but it is almost never the primary driver. The ecological cascade, the rats in the nests, the pigs in the understory, the goats stripping the vegetation, the forest falling to axes, is what finishes the job. The dodo did not go extinct because it was stupid. That narrative is comfortable but false. The dodo went extinct because it had the catastrophic misfortune of evolving, over millions of years, into an organism perfectly calibrated for a world without ground-dwelling mammals. And then the entire inventory of mammalian threats, rats, pigs, monkeys, goats, cats, dogs, and the most destructive mammal of all, arrived simultaneously on wooden ships from 15,000 kilometers away. Every adaptation that had served the dodo flawlessly for millions of years became a lethal vulnerability overnight. Flightlessness, which conserved energy in a predator-free paradise, meant it could not escape. Ground nesting, which was perfectly safe when the forest floor contained no egg predators, became a guarantee of reproductive failure. Ecological naivete, the calm fearlessness that came from millennia without threats, meant the bird walked into the arms of its killers without resistance. Slow reproduction, which was efficient when survival rates were high, could not compensate for the catastrophic nest losses caused by invasive species. If you had taken a clutch of dodo eggs from Mauritius in 1590, 8 years before Van Warwijk's arrival, and raised the chicks in a predator-proof sanctuary with intact native forest, the dodo would almost certainly still be alive today. The species was not on a downward trajectory, it was not failing, it was not struggling against internal biological limitations, it was thriving, and then its entire world was dismantled around it in the geological equivalent of an eye blink. The real question the dodo story leaves behind is not about a bad-tasting bird on a volcanic island. It is about how many species alive right now are in the functionally identical position, precisely adapted to a world that is being restructured faster than any evolutionary process can track. Walking calmly through their days without any awareness that the pressures accumulating around them, habitat fragmentation, climate disruption, invasive species, chemical contamination, are eroding the environmental stability that their survival depends on. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published a global assessment stating that approximately 1 million animal and plant species are currently threatened with extinction, more than at any previous point in human history. The primary drivers listed in that assessment read like a description of what happened on Mauritius between 1598 and 1681. Habitat loss, invasive species, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and the compounding interactions between all five. The dodo walked right up to the Dutch sailors, because it had never learned to walk away from anything. That was not stupidity. It was the rational product of millions of years of living in a world where walking away was unnecessary. And we repaid that innocence with total extinction, delivered in less than a single human lifetime. The mechanisms that erased the dodo from the earth are not historical relics. They are actively operating right now, on islands, in rainforests, across coral reefs, and throughout oceans on every continent. The species being driven toward extinction today have no more understanding of the forces acting on them than the dodo had of the rats that ate its eggs in the darkness. We have sequenced the genome of the victim. We have excavated its bones from marsh sediment. We are spending millions of dollars attempting to engineer its resurrection in a laboratory. The real question is not whether we can bring the dodo back. The real question is whether knowing everything we now know about how species disappear will change what we do to the ones that are still here. Every week, this channel covers the events that mainstream history books leave out. The deep time stories that change how you understand the world you are living in right now. If you want to be here when the next one drops, subscribe. And if you want to see what happened when a geological event erased an entire civilization from the archaeological record, click the video on screen now.